cannot imagine what it was like for Eleanor. Married for the first time at 13, twice a mother by the time she was divorced from Louis VII 15 years later, and then to have met the passion and joy which she seems to have found with Henry II, only then to be treated not as a lord, not as a lady, but as a wife, not to be cast off, but to be put down and put in jail. Only after his death and the monumental struggles between Henry and his own sons, those struggles that illuminated the difficulty of the inheritance patterns and crowning patterns of the English and the French crowns, did Eleanor herself come back into power. Was she once more my lord? In her own right, as the wife of two kings and the mother of kings, Eleanor's wealth and influence afforded her fields of actions by no means insignificant in her husband's governments, as shown by Henry II's decision to keep her closely guarded. Without power, there was no need to keep her guarded. She was kept mostly in England, far away from the Aquitaine, where she might have been able to mount her own independent rebellion against her husband for the last 15 years of his life. Eleanor's unquestioned importance in the governments of her son Richard I and John demonstrates that her influence and her political reach was recognized during her widowhood years as well. The Dowager Queen's passion for power and for her family's future propelled Eleanor's very active final years. She was also active in the marital arrangements of all her children and of her grandchildren, ensuring the noble continuity of her line, knowing that that act of continuity would be the most powerful act she could make of projecting herself, her will, into the future. She fought off all threats to her children, except for the most implacable one, death, as one by one they passed away, leaving her in the end only feckless King John of England, who ruled catastrophically as an English king. But Eleanor first took full advantage of her reign as Queen Mother when her son Richard the Lionheart, Richard I, inherited the throne. Eleanor and Henry's daughter Matilda, herself the mother of 10, died in the same month as her father. Their son Geoffrey had already died in 1186. So though the ranks of Eleanor's children were thinning, Marie and Alex, by Lewis, were still thriving, as were Richard and her 3 younger children by Henry, Eleanor, Johanna, and John. Richard I, as a surviving eldest son, was close to his mother, and she encouraged his ambitions. Richard confirmed Eleanor's control as well, Eleanor's control of her dower lands from her marriage to Henry. She had not only the Aquitaine, but dower lands specifically set aside for her by Henry. Being delivered from captivity herself, she went about delivering others in one of those nice moments with great political, passionate, resounding result. She got all of those who had been on and Henry's enemy list out of jail and got them not only out of prison, but into the hearts of Richard. She moved with great energy to secure the loyalty to Richard of the barons and the free men alike, and she helped to arrange a glorious homecoming for Richard to England for his coronation in Westminster on the 3rd of September of the year 1189. But Richard's interests were not with ruling England. He milked England for the revenue he required to set off on crusade by way of his own ducal territories. And he went with Philip Augustus, the old enemy of the English and yet the friend of the sons of Henry II. Mother and son conspired in a small piece of successful diplomacy and very slicing revenge on their father, Henry, when they repudiated Richard's engagement to Philip Augustus's half-sister, Alice. Now, this Alice had been raised in Henry II's court when Eleanor was put aside and sent to the Aquitaine and kept under imprisonment. Alice, who was reputed by Richard himself to have been one of his father's mistresses, a sort of Woody Allen moment, like the chronicler's later allegations that Eleanor had perhaps too intimate a relationship with Geoffrey, the father of Henry II. In some extraordinary way, Richard was able to release himself from his engagement to Alice without alienating Philip Augustus, brother of the rejected bride. Eleanor spent much of 1190 and 91 traveling across Europe to solidify her and her son's alliances. And then she returned to England through a circuitous route, where she ruled the kingdom as Richard's regent while he was away on crusade and travel. She arranged then his marriage, and this time to Berengaria, Princess of Navarre, and this took place in Cyprus in May of 1191, when Richard was on his way to the Holy Land. The choice of Berengaria, whom Richard of Devizes called more sensible than stunning, had another advantage. It ensured that Richard would have a wife who would not challenge the prerogatives or authority of her mother-in-law, Eleanor, or of Eleanor's relationship with her son. The rejection of Alice of France also put Philip Augustus, Richard's friend, but nevertheless King of France, on notice that Eleanor and Richard were now people to be reckoned with. It also tells us Princess of Navarre, King of England, mother from Aquitaine, marriage in Cyprus, how entirely international this European world was. Royal worlds are always international, and Eleanor maintained that extraordinary reach of royal houses in her own day and projected it into the future. Richard was taken prisoner of war in December of 1193, and in the meantime, Eleanor countered a conspiracy between her younger son, John, and Philip Augustus by threatening John into submission to her. She simultaneously worked for Richard's release, raising the staggering sum of 100,000 marks for his ransom, much more than the annual revenue of the kingdom. And we want to remember at that point, in crusade and in warfare, it was far more profitable for your enemy to take you ransom rather than kill you. The aim of war was not simply to overcome your enemies, it was to overcome your enemies and get their wealth simultaneously. It was the primary form of wealth transfer besides marriage in the Middle Ages. Eleanor herself sailed to Germany. Remember that she is now 70 years old, in order to join Richard as he paid homage to the Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI at Mainz. By doing so, they assured the emperor's loyalty to Richard's interests above those of Philip Augustus and John. This is a world of one conspiracy after another. It's no wonder it's attracted so many movie makers. In an escalating series of successes, Eleanor accompanied her favorite son on a triumphal tour as they made their way back to England. And on April 17th of 1194, she, not Berengaria, sat as his enthroned equal, as he once more ceremoniously took the crown at that ancient English capital of Winchester. Thus Eleanor could presume that she and her prime progeny were secure, and now that John and Richard were reconciled, she herself retired from public view later in 1194 to spend her final years at her beloved Fontevraud. She was an old woman. Wasn't that enough? We have records of the many gifts and endowments that Eleanor gave to Fontevraud. While Richard was warring and building, Eleanor, in her honorable retreat, showered the house with gifts, having walls constructed to protect it, providing an endowment for the habits of the religious, donating a gold processional cross adorned with jewels, and giving them many gold and silver vessels and silken cloths. It must have given her deep satisfaction when, in 1196, her daughter Johanna took as her second husband Raymond VI of Toulouse, thus once more yoking Toulouse with Aquitaine, satisfying one of Eleanor's most fundamental political desires from her girlhood forward. Her family seemed to be moving from glory to glory when, in July of 1198, through Richard's efforts, her grandson, Otto of Brunswick, Duke of Poitou, that land that was directly Eleanor's by inheritance, reached the coveted heights of the Holy Roman Emperor. Their grandson reached the imperial heights that Henry himself desired and which had been denied to him. In 1199, however, catastrophe struck. Tragedy began again for Eleanor. By the beginning of 1199, Eleanor had lost all but 4 of her children. While putting down a petty insurrection by laying siege to the minor castle of Chaluz, Richard was mortally injured. The story tells us that he was wearing no armor when he saw the archer taking aim at him, and as the arrow was released, Richard himself turned to the archer and forgave him. He was gallant until the end. He sent for his mother, who rushed to his side and attended him as he was dying of gangrene. After naming his brother John as his heir, he died on April 6, 1199, in the presence of his mother, who had loved him beyond any of her children. In September, Eleanor witnessed the death of her daughter Johanna and of Johanna's infant son. But between times, she once more acted on a son's behalf, summoning as much support as possible for John's kingship. She was herself in the forefront of Richard's soldiers. She led them to confront and defeat the forces supporting her grandson Arthur of Brittany's candidacy for the English throne. And she was able to bring Richard's soldiers to John, and John was crowned on May 25th of 1199. But Eleanor's diplomatic missions on his behalf were just beginning. The months after Richard died witnessed a flurry of activity. Eleanor issued numerous charters, which, as H.G. Richardson declared, are as authoritative and binding as the charters of any English king. Nor did she simply give written orders and commands. She herself led the mercenaries, led the soldiers that Richard had been commanding north to Anjou, where they vanquished the supporters of her grandson, Arthur of Brittany, who was claiming the throne of England. Next, she traveled through Poitou and Gascony to affirm those regions' loyalty. So then, having in July of 1199 formally recognized Philip Augustus's overlordship of Poitou, not of the Aquitaine, which she held independently, she and John entered into an arrangement that made them co-rulers of Poitou and Aquitaine. It's a very odd and interesting agreement that they made. They ordered that all homages, all acts of fidelity and services be rendered to him as liege lord. And Eleanor then bestowed on John, whom she called her heir and her dearest son, all of Poitou, which he then rendered to her in homage. In turn, John acknowledged that Poitou was his mother's and declared that during her lifetime, his mother should have and hold Poitou as domina, as lady, as lord, and that neither he nor she would alienate it to anyone else without mutual consent, except for donations that they wished to give on behalf of their own souls. Perhaps the phraseology of Eleanor's charters, which were very carefully and probably extremely carefully chosen, perhaps this phraseology was intended to suggest her endorsement that John's claim to the throne of England was rightful and that his claims to her lands would also be rightful. It was tying up once more all the knots and making sure that her lands and that Poitou would not be able to be alienated to the French crown. Eleanor spent the next year negotiating with Philip Augustus and John in order to secure lasting peace between France and England. She sealed that peace by promising one of her granddaughters as a bride for Philip's son, Louis, thus once more bringing together Aquitaine, England, and France. She herself crossed to Spain in very harsh winter and returned in the springtime with the superb Blanche, Princess of Castile, whose marriage to Louis on May 23, 1200, brought the royal families of Europe into alignment once more and produced, as a result, the future king who was also known as Louis IX. He was also, in another respect, known as St. Louis. Every time you look at the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris with its glorious high ceilings and extraordinary stained glass, you can remember that it was built by one who was married to the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. This marriage ensured a lasting peace as long as peace has ever lasted between England and France. Eleanor's last years, however, were constantly marred by foolish decisions made by her son, King John, whose cause she nevertheless ceaselessly tried to protect. John badly needed her assistance because his reckless, ill-advised marriage to Isabel of Angoulême on August 24th of 1200 brought him once more into conflict with Philip Augustus. Early in 1201, Eleanor intervened from her sickbed in order to help John retain the allegiance of a powerful Pontevin lord. After John was, however, formally condemned by French courts on April 28th of 1202, Philip Augustus took the opportunity to invade John's lands. Philip Augustus also had as a goal the union of all of what he saw as French property and wanted to include the Aquitaine and Poitou in that. Eleanor, then 78, went to her son's aid in the battlefield, and her presence in the field resulted in one of John's very few military victories in his lifetime. In the summer of 1202, she was besieged in the castle of Mirabeau by her grandson, Arthur of Brittany, and she was freed when her son, King John, came to her rescue in a spectacular display of strength. It's hard for us to imagine these scenes in which we have brother fighting against brother, father fighting against son, grandson fighting against grandfather and uncle. All of these conflicts that take place among the royalty, which means they kept it in the family. John's one monumental military success was the lifting of the siege of the castle of Mirabeau in July of 1202. But the Plantagenet-Capetian struggles continued. Arthur was murdered, Arthur of Brittany, a great contentious thorn in John's side. Was he murdered by John, as has frequently been alleged? Was he murdered at John's urging? It's one of those historical questions that remains unanswered. After her rescue, Eleanor retired, we think, to Fontevraud. She would there have heard the sad news that Chateau Gaillard, the impregnable Plantagenet fortress built by her beloved son Richard, the place he loved most as the most elegant of his castles, fell to Capetian forces in March of 1204. On April Fool's Day, April 1st of 1204, 3 weeks later, the 80-year-old Eleanor died. She had outlived all but 2 of her 10 or more children. She did not live to see the shame of John signing the Magna Carta on June 15th of 1215. What for the rest of us, of course, may seem to be the great success of the Magna Carta was a shame to kingship. She had carefully supervised the marriages of her many children and many of her grandchildren. Her obituary at Fontevraud states that she illuminated the world with the brilliance of her royal progeny. She graced the nobility of her birth with the honesty of her life, enriched it with her moral excellence, adorned it with the flower of her virtues, and by her fame for matchless goodness, surpassed all the queens of the world. Surpassed all the queens of the world. When we think of Eleanor, we think of a queen who did surpass most of the queens we can name and of whose history we know. She was a lord as well as a lady to her people. She was the one who made sure that small monasteries were protected, as well as people living in little villages given various charters and alms. We look at her as someone who was vast in large measure because of her fecundity. She had that gift of women to give birth. And in the birth she gave, she was able to raise children, many of them successfully to adulthood, many of them having had many children of their own. She couldn't make them act like kings, but she could make them kings. And she looked around the scope of all of her grandchildren and picked and chose among them which of them could function best in relation to which other noble house, so that she was making herself a tapestry of the future on which we can now see all the nations of Europe. When we look at the crowned heads of Europe for most of the history of European dynasties, we will find among them always heirs of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Of her royal progeny we are sure, for Eleanor's fecundity was prolific and her descendants were numerous. Interestingly, historians today are just beginning to emphasize the importance of mothers in family descent traced through the maternal line. We are accustomed as historians to tracing genealogies through the line of the father and losing track of where the mother's line leads. But look at Eleanor, who had 2 daughters who became princesses of France, and all of those children who were the nobility of England. She was just as careful with the marriages of the women of her line as she was in the diplomatic support of the men of her line. Eleanor's greatest skill, though probably not her greatest joy, was the management of motherhood. Her greatest skill was the management of motherhood. For her, motherhood was not necessarily sentimental as it is in the bourgeois modern world. It did not mean that she was constantly assuring each of her children that they were equal in her affections. She chose Richard as her favorite child. He had what she considered glamour, wit, intelligence. It wasn't that she ignored her other children, but she found other political purposes for them. We don't know much about the innards of Eleanor's maternity, but we do know how carefully she worked on the outside, playing sometimes her sons off against each other, always making sure that her daughters had good marriages, even being with them upon occasion when they gave birth, and sometimes tragically. Eleanor was able to outlive almost all her daughters because she did not die in childbirth. It is remarkable to see this woman who went through so many pregnancies and survived all those pregnancies to watch her own children die in pregnancy and in childbirth. But when we think of her maternity, we think about maternity ratcheted up to a global level, because in her case, her interests were in assuring not only that her goals for them as people who had productive lives would be carefully cultivated, but also in making sure that the land to which she felt responsible, the land for which she felt responsible, would be successfully maintained by members of her own family. Her family had ruled the Aquitaine for a very long time before Eleanor's birth. Her grandfather, the great troubadour poet, while he brought wit to the land, was wise enough always never to let it be alienated from him by going off on crusade. The lesson that Eleanor learned as a young girl, the bad lesson from her uncle Raymond of Toulouse, is that he left his land to settle over in the other world, the Outremer, the Holy Land. That may have been a grand thing in the eyes of popes and the eyes of heaven, but it was not a grand thing in the eyes of Eleanor, who thought that that land should never have been betrayed and alienated from her family. One of her earliest life goals, a goal to which she pledged Louis, who was unable to deliver, and the goal to which she pledged Henry, who was unable to deliver, and the goal that was only finally achieved by marriage, was getting back Toulouse, making sure that she was able to hold on to the shape of the south and southwestern France as she had known it as a child. She was a great politician, a woman who understood the geography and landscape of her own people's desires, and someone who tried very hard to understand the geography and landscape of love. Love is something we saw with her almost exclusively with her husband Henry and her son Richard. What her other loves were is subject to rumor. Her reputation was sullied beyond that of any other medieval queen. We'll be looking at the political purposes for sullying Eleanor's reputation. The English had good motive to do so, because they felt that the woman who had given them John as a king and who had alienated Henry II from his goodwill and good humor was obviously responsible in some moral level. The French, how could the French feel about a woman who, having, after many years, produced only 2 daughters to their king, divorced him and married the man who became King of England with whom she had so many sons? Hers was a reputation ripe for the breaking. And in her own time, as well as in later times, and even in ours, Eleanor's is the reputation of a woman from the Middle Ages, which has been most vandalized by artists and scholars alike. Next time, we'll be thinking about Eleanor's reputation.